Hello and welcome to the Anishinaabe History Podcast. I'm Chris Waite. I was born in Saskatchewan in the 1970s. When I went to school there, I wasn't taught about treaties or about Indigenous history. Even though my mom is Ojibwe and my dad was a school teacher, I didn't learn about treaties or Indigenous history. My mom didn't talk about it because of her abuse at the Indian day school she had to attend. My dad didn't know anything about these things because he's from Britain, and this knowledge isn't required to become a Canadian citizen. In the last month, in 2023, Saskatchewan has put up signs declaring the boundaries of traditional treaties. My reaction was, it's about fucking time. The lack of knowledge, the purposeful obfuscation of treaties and Indigenous history is a major part of the problem with stereotypes and prejudice in Canada regarding First Nations people. I'm here to correct that. What I've learned after 20 plus years of studying what isn't in school curricula and what has happened in courtrooms and historical documents has shown me the breadth and depth of institutional racism directed against Indigenous people that has been going on for many, many generations.
Saskatchewan lies on several treaty territories, and soon the boundary of the two largest, Treaty 6 and Treaty 4, will be identified by an official provincial highway sign on Highway 11 between Saskatoon and Regina. Saskatchewan Treaty Commissioner Mary Culbertson says the signs will help educate people about the treaties.
It's a small thing, but it's a big thing too, because it's going to be the first sign. Right, and we have how many treaty territories throughout where this province lies now, right? There's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and Treaty 5 as well. And they go across where these provincial boundaries are, right? And we have to acknowledge that.
Culbertson says the approval process for the design and language to be used on the signs hit a snag with the provincial government over Indigenous language and signage standards.
We have a Languages Act now. We have to acknowledge that our Indigenous languages were here long before English or the two official languages of this country, and we have to start acknowledging that and keep pushing those things. And our governments have that responsibility to be enabling legislation so they can have these Indigenous languages included.
Culbertson says people in positions of power have the responsibility to move things forward, even if it's as small as a sign.
You know, these treaties were here before these provinces were created, before these roads were here. That boundary was there since 1874. You know, so it took that long for it to be acknowledged in a modern day context with a sign.
Leanne Sanders, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
In 1814, the Second Treaty of Greenville was signed. The British had just been defeated by the Americans in the War of 1812. Tecumseh, who was a voice for a confederation of the Indigenous people of Turtle Island into a unified force, was dead. The Treaty of Ghent, an agreement between Britain and America, was also signed in 1814. What was in the 1814 Treaty of Greenville and who signed it? The agreement is titled A Treaty of Peace and Friendship between the United States of America and the tribes of Native Americans called the Wyandots, Delawares, Shawnees, Senecas, and Miamis. The terms of the treaty include the following articles. Quote, Article 1 established peace between the Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Kickapoo with the U.S., Wyandot, Delaware, Shawnee, and Seneca. Article 2 called for the tribes to give aid to the U.S. in the war against Great Britain and its Native American allies, and not to make an independent peace. Article 3 had the tribes acknowledge themselves under the protection of the U.S. and no other power. In Article 4, the U.S. promised to respect their boundaries with the Native American nations established before the war if the other conditions of the treaty were performed. End quote. The Americans wanted the Indigenous people as their allies and subjects, but not as their enemies. They especially didn't want the British gaining the upper hand. Other treaties signed in the year 1814 include the Anglo-Dutch Treaty, the Treaty of Paris, and the Treaty of Fort Jackson. In 1815, a lot of treaties were signed. For example, there was the Lake Simcoe-Lake Huron Purchase. It is otherwise known as Crown Treaty No. 16. It was an agreement between the Ojibwe of that area and the British province of Upper Canada. The Ojibwe Chippewa signatories were Kennebekonene, Esants, and Muskoke. The Muskoka region of Ontario is likely named after Chief Muskoke. There were also the treaties of Portage des Sioux, signed in 1815 in Missouri. These treaties were partly due to Article 9 of the Treaty of Ghent and partly to reaffirm earlier treaties made between Indigenous nations and the United States. A Wikipedia article reads, quote, "The earlier treaties included the Treaty of St. Louis, 1804, in which the Sac and Fox ceded a swath of land from Missouri through Illinois and Wisconsin, and the Treaty of Fort Clark in 1808, in which the Osage Nation ceded Missouri and Arkansas east of Fort Clark. The treaties were to form the legal basis in which tribes were to be relocated west of Missouri in Indian Territory, and which was to clear the way for the states to enter the Union." End quote. In 1815, there was also the Treaty of Spring Wells. This was an agreement between the United States and the Wyandot, Delaware, Seneca, Shawnee, Miami, Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. It was signed at Fort Wayne in what is now Detroit. On Wikipedia it states, quote, "The object of the treaty was to absolve the Native Americans for supporting Great Britain in the War of 1812 and secure their future allegiance to the United States. The treaty officially ended all hostilities between the U.S. and the Native Americans and reaffirmed the 1795 Treaty of Greenville and all subsequent treaties to which they were, respectively, parties. The U.S. agreed to restore to the Native Americans all of their possessions, rights, and privileges as of 1811. In return, the Native Americans agreed to place themselves under the protection of the U.S. government only and repudiate any association with Britain." End quote. As with most treaties, the Treaty of Spring Wells referenced earlier treaties, such as the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, as a foundation for making peace agreements. In 1816, the Council of Three Fires abandoned their claims to the territory ceded under the Treaty of St. Louis, 1804. The Treaty of St. Louis also refers to a series of treaties signed between 1804 and 1824. There are 14 treaties included in the Treaty of St. Louis series. Examples of treaties in the St. Louis series include the Sauk and Quashquami land cessions in 1804. The aforementioned Council of Three Fires relinquished claim to land in 1816. In 1818, the Osage ceded land to the United States and signed the treaty near St. Louis. Then, in 1825, the Shawnee people did the same.
In a creation story of the Dakota, Mother Earth gave birth to the first grandmother and grandfather in the heart of the upper Mississippi, in the place they called Minnesota. From their descendants came the four tribes of the eastern Dakota, the Bedewa-Kantuan, the people of the Mystic Lake, the Wahpekute, the hunters in the leaves. Further west were the Sisituan, the fish camp people, and their relatives, the Wahpetuan, the dwellers in the leaves. 4 council fires in the great Dakota Nation. The Dakota were the first of their people to encounter the invasion of the whites. For 200 years, they fought against them and alongside them, traded with them, became their relatives, and adopted some of their ways. But as a crush of new immigrants arrived, they soon found they were not wanted in their own land. They were in the way of white progress. A series of treaties were made, and each time promises, bribes, and threats yielded more and more land. Until by 1858, the Dakota were confined to a small strip of land along the Minnesota River.
In 1825, the first Prairie du Chien Treaty was signed. I'll read what is said about the treaty on treatiesmatter.org. Quote, in 1825, Dakota and Ojibwe leaders from what is now Minnesota joined members of nearly a dozen other nations for a peace treaty in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. The U.S. was ostensibly concerned with violence among the American Indian nations on its western border, and insisted that living within set boundaries for the first time in history would solve the problem. American Indian delegation members pointed out that the game they hunted for their livelihoods did not recognize boundaries, and the arrangement would cause more problems than it solved. The treaty was a compromise. Boundaries were set, but articles of the treaty acknowledged that American Indians would ignore the boundaries. End quote. The Dakota signatories of this treaty were Little Crow, Sleepy Eye, Red Wing, and Wabasha. The Ojibwe signatories were Broken Tooth, Hole in the Day Sr., and Loon's Foot. The American signatories were Scott Campbell, Henry Schoolcraft, Thomas Biddle, C.C. Trowbridge, B.F. Harney, and Lawrence Taliaferro. This treaty cleared the title to Indigenous land, according to the Americans. By clearing the title, it was then easier for Americans to purchase lands from a single Indigenous nation, rather than deal with land that was held in common by multiple Indigenous nations. This is when land on Turtle Island west of the Mississippi was becoming privatized for settlement by non-Indigenous peoples. Within 3 years of the 1825 treaty being signed, the United States was purchasing lands that were within the boundary lines of the treaty. Quote, lines on a map did not end historical tensions among American Indians west of the Mississippi. In fact, these tensions would rise as the eastern tribes were moved across the river. In 1830, William Clark engineered another treaty at Prairie du Chien with selected leaders of the Sac and Fox, plus leaders of the Dakota, Omaha, Iowa, Oto, and Missouri. After threatening a military invasion and trade embargo, the U.S. insisted that peace among American Indians would require land cessions by the Dakota and Sac and Fox. One large tract of this land would remain open to the Sac and Fox for hunting and other purposes, but would also be opened to settlement by other American Indian nations. A similar strip would become a neutral ground, and Ho-Chunk people would be relocated there as a buffer between the Dakota and the Sac and Fox. End quote. Basically, the indigenous people of Turtle Island were forced under threat of war to sign treaties so that the Americans could legally purchase the land from a singular owner. Formerly, land was held in common by indigenous nations. The native people hunted animals that didn't obey imaginary lines. The second Prairie du Chien Treaty was signed in 1829.
The circle begins in Mankato, Minnesota. 38 Dakota men are hanged in a mass execution. Their families imprisoned or scattered across the plains. When the wars ended, the Cultural War began.
What happened after the Anglo-American Convention of 1818 was made? Did that agreement have an impact on subsequent treaties established between the British, the Americans, and the indigenous nations? How did the new global regime of Anglo-American hegemony impact the indigenous peoples who were forced to abide by the 49th parallel boundary? War and genocide. And then the cover-up. And then what has been taught to school children is that God chose the white man to replace the lesser races so that we can eat beef and pork and watch TV. All the cowboy and Indian movies and programs. Even before TV was invented, Buffalo Bill had the story of winning the West monetized. War and genocide packaged as entertainment and education. I say beef and pork not out of religious conviction, but out of ecological knowledge. The buffalo herds were destroyed on purpose through American policy in order to break the core of Plains Indians' culture. That's not replacement theory, that's replacement history. But even before the destruction of the buffalo, there were punitive expeditions engaged in by the Americans against Indigenous peoples. The so-called Dakota War is an example. That conflict stemmed from broken promises and desperation. That conflict began after an American state was established upon Indigenous land. That conflict was after the Trail of Tears began, and the Trail of Tears began because of an act of legislation by the American government in 1830. It should be known, moreover, that the groundwork for the Trail of Tears via the Indian Removal Act began many years before it was actually implemented. Greed makes people do evil things, and evil is insidious. It would creep forward, consuming the First Nations people of Turtle Island until the so-called numbered treaties of Canada would be signed under coercion. And then, after that, the land theft began. It was all part of the plan. I'll read a paragraph from Saskatchewan, A New History by Bill Waiser, written in 2005. Quote, "Even more important than the numbers involved were the timing and intent of Treaty 10. The Dene and Cree agreed to enter treaty in 1906-07 on the understanding that their subsistence activities would be secure from interference. They were deeply troubled about the future, about the threats to their traditional lifestyle, and looked to the Crown to provide protection and support. But if the Canadian government was genuinely concerned with preserving Indian hunting, fishing, and gathering practices in northern Saskatchewan, it would have acted much sooner instead of waiting for the creation of the new province. It could also have offered more liberal terms, even allowed actual negotiations. Ottawa, however, had another motive. It wanted to extinguish Aboriginal title in the region in order to clear the way for future development and used the treaty to realize this goal. It amounted to a gentleman's way to take without grabbing. Ironically, the Dene and Cree, and not the two treaty commissioners, had the better understanding of the changes they would face in the coming years, but they could do little more than express their concerns before signing the treaty. The creation of Saskatchewan and Alberta had broken the old fur trade north into a number of powerless pieces, creating northern colonies. And the Indian and Métis people, as vestiges of that old Northwest, were expected to have no part in the region's future. As Frank Oliver, the federal minister of the Interior, bluntly told the House of Commons a year before Treaty 10 was introduced, "If it becomes a question between the Indians and the whites, the interests of the whites will have to be provided for." End quote. That's all for today's episode. Stay tuned for more episodes in the future. I'm Chris Waite, and this has been the Anishinaabe History Podcast.